Welcome to the Riddles and Secrets of History channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. For many centuries, humanity has feared creatures that return from the world of the dead. The vampire figure is perhaps one of the most striking and terrifying examples of this ancient fear. While today vampires are characters in novels, films, and TV series, in the past they were beings in whose reality people believed absolutely seriously. They were seen as the cause of diseases, epidemics, and misfortunes. They were so feared that the deceased were often buried with extreme caution, attempting to prevent their return. So, where did this unusual fear originate, and why have vampires penetrated our consciousness so deeply? The ancient roots of vampire myths. Blood has always been perceived by humanity as something both sacred and terrifying. It symbolized life and energy. This is why creatures capable of sucking blood posed a direct threat to human existence itself. Psychologists explain the emergence of the vampire myth as a profound fear of losing vitality and control over one's own life. Mythologists claim that the image of blood-sucking creatures appeared as an attempt to explain the unexplainable, sudden deaths, epidemics, mysterious illnesses, and the fear of the unknown afterlife. Interestingly, bloodsuckers appeared independently in different world cultures, acquiring various features but retaining a common foundation, a connection to death and nocturnal activity. Hence the image of the night hunter returning from the afterlife. In our lecture today, we will trace how the image of vampires changed across different cultures and eras, delve into Slavic and Romanian myths, get acquainted with the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, who became the prototype for the famous Dracula, and learn how people tried to fight vampires in reality, from peasant rituals to official police investigations. Today's lecture will help us understand this phenomenon more deeply, showing that vampirism is not only a fear and a superstition but also a reflection of the cultural, historical, and even medical aspects of human existence. Vampires in ancient civilizations. The phenomenon of vampirism is older than it seems at first glance. The fear of creatures that drink the blood of the living is so deeply rooted that it goes back to the dawn of human civilization. Mesopotamia, Akimu and Utaku. Even the ancient Sumerians, who inhabited the territories of Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, believed in spirits and demons that returned from the afterlife to torment the living and take their strength. Among them, the beings known as the Akimu and the Utaku stood out. These were grim, incorporeal ghosts of the deceased who could not find peace and wandered at night in search of the vitality of the living. They were considered not just symbols of death but real threats against which people had to defend themselves with rituals and spells. Ancient Egypt, the bloodthirst of Sekhmet. Particularly striking is the image of bloodthirsty creatures in the culture of ancient Egypt, where mythological narratives often intertwined with real history. One of the most prominent examples is the story of the goddess Sekhmet, a mighty warrior and daughter of the sun god Ra. According to an ancient myth, humanity had once so angered the gods that Ra decided to punish it by sending his daughter Sekhmet to earth. This goddess had the head of a lioness and was characterized by exceptional cruelty and an unrestrained temper. Sekhmet began to slaughter people with fury, shedding blood and ruthlessly drinking it. Soon, humanity was on the verge of complete extinction. Realizing the terrifying destructiveness of his own daughter, the god Ra decided to stop her. But this proved difficult. Sekhmet was intoxicated by blood and had no intention of ceasing her deadly work. Ra then resorted to a trick. He ordered the fields to be flooded with an immense quantity of beer dyed blood red to make it look like fresh blood. Seeing the sea of this drink, Sekhmet mistook it for blood and began to drink greedily. Intoxicated, she forgot about the slaughter and eventually fell asleep. This is how humanity avoided complete annihilation. This legend is noteworthy because blood here is not just a liquid but a symbol of life itself. Sekhmet's consumption of blood expressed people's fear of the gods' wrath, diseases, and inevitable death. Many traits that would later be solidified in the classic image of the vampire are already evident in this story: the thirst for blood as a reflection of the thirst for life, an irresistible force, and the need for special magical means of protection. Thus, even in deep antiquity, long before the emergence of the more familiar vampire figures, humanity invented bloodsuckers that reflected its deep-seated fears and beliefs. Studying these ancient roots allows us to better understand why later vampire legends gained such popularity and became one of the most enduring images in culture. Greco-Roman mythology, Empusa, Lamia, and Strix. Having explored the ancient origins of vampirism, we will now move on to the world of classical Greece and Rome, where bloodsuckers acquired new, even darker and more dramatic features. If in the cultures of the Middle East vampire-like creatures were perceived as demons and the embodiment of divine wrath, in ancient Greece these images took on characteristics much closer to the modern understanding. Here, beings emerged who were endowed with tragic fates and complex characters. Among them, the Empusa, Lamia, and Strix especially stand out. These are ancient vampire prototypes whose stories are filled with horror, sorrow, and mystical secrets. Greek prototypes, Empusa and Lamia. In Greek mythology, Empusa was a demonic creature, a messenger of the goddess Hecate, capable of changing her appearance. She would appear before travelers in the guise of a beautiful maiden, seducing them to drink their blood and drain their vitality. Such tales reflected the ancient fear of the unknown dangers of night roads, which held the risk of death and the loss of life force. Even more interesting and tragic is the story of Lamia. She was formerly the beautiful queen of Libya, a beloved of Zeus, who was cruelly punished by the jealous goddess Hera. Having lost her children, who were killed on the command of the enraged goddess, Lamia went mad with grief and pain. Her despair turned into a monstrous rage, and she began to hunt other people's children, sucking their blood, trying to alleviate her endless pain, if only for a moment. Legend says that Lamia became a demoness with bloodthirsty habits and the ability to take the form of a woman to more easily find her victims. This tragic figure reflected not only people's fear of the supernatural but also the profound terror of losing loved ones, who might return as cruel beings bringing death and suffering. Roman mythology had its own bloody figure close to vampires, the Strix, a creature in the form of a terrifying bird with huge claws that drank the blood of infants. It is from the name of this creature that the term Strigoi, designating vampires in Eastern Europe, later originated. The Romans believed that Strixes appeared at night and stole children to feed on their blood and life force. Special protective rites were performed against them, hanging protective amulets around the house and reciting specific incantations. Thus, already in antiquity, several key aspects of future vampire legends were being formed: the seduction of the victim, nocturnal attacks, blood-sucking, and even the tragedy that underlies the transformation of a human into a monster. The figures of Empusa, Lamia, and Strix became essential prototypes for the subsequent myths about vampires that spread throughout Europe and became part of humanity's cultural heritage. Slavic traditions, the Vurdalak. Now, having examined the ancient roots of vampire legends, we move on to the Slavic traditions closer to us, the world of Vurdalaks and Strigoi, where myths intersect with the real fears and practices of everyday life of the time. In ancient Slavic culture, vampirism took on particularly vivid and distinctive features, embodied in the figure known to us as the Vurdalak. But the beliefs of our ancestors differed greatly from the romanticized and elegant vampire familiar to modern people. The Vurdalak was not a sophisticated and mysterious creature hidden behind the facade of an aristocrat. It was a ghastly and untidy figure of a deceased person who returns from the grave to torment and kill their loved ones, destroying the customary way of life in villages and settlements. The origin and fear of the Vurdalak. The Slavs believed that a person who died a sudden, unclean death could turn into a Vurdalak, a suicide, an executed criminal, a victim of a terrible disease, or one who died a violent death. People who died without the necessary burial rites or who were cursed during their lifetime were considered no less dangerous. Villagers and settlers desperately feared this return of the deceased and therefore developed a series of rituals to protect themselves and their families from the visits of such uninvited guests. Anti-vampire burial practices. One of the most interesting facts is that the Slavs had special burial practices to prevent the deceased from turning into a Vurdalak. Bodies suspected of having the potential to rise were specifically buried face down, believing that the corpse would lose its orientation and be unable to climb out of the grave. Furthermore, to guarantee the impossibility of reanimation, the deceased had stones inserted into their mouths, heavy slabs placed on their chests, or their hearts pierced with an aspen stake, thereby symbolically keeping them in the world of the dead. Such burials are found by archaeologists throughout Eastern Europe to this day, which confirms how real these fears were. Interestingly, the Slavs were convinced that if the deceased did turn into a Vurdalak, it would come at night to its former home and, in a voice similar to a human's, ask to be let inside. A terrible fate awaited those who succumbed to pity and opened the door: illness, death, and the inevitable transformation into the same monster. It was this element that gave a special, frightening power to the Slavic legends, making them even more vivid and convincing. The Arnold Pole case, a real investigation. However, these superstitions and rituals were not merely folklore. They became so serious that they sometimes attracted the attention of official authorities. One of the most famous cases occurred in Serbia in the early 18th century. This is a real, documented episode known as the case of Arnold Pole. In 1726, a peasant named Arnold Pole died in the Serbian village of Medveda. Sometime after his death, several local residents began to die from a strange, unknown illness. The villagers decided that Arnold, having returned from the dead and attacking the living, was to blame. The fear became so widespread that local authorities appealed to Austrian officials, who officially investigated the incident. The commission that arrived exhumed Arnold's grave and, according to the reports, saw that his body had not decomposed at all, and there was even fresh blood on his lips. To calm the people and stop the panic, Arnold Pole's body was pierced with a wooden stake and then burned. A similar fate later befell several other suspicious graves. This case was widely covered by the European press in the 18th century and became one of the first examples of the official investigation of vampirism by authorities in Europe. Thus, the Slavic image of the Vurdalak and the real stories about such creatures were far from the romance and mystery of modern vampire legends. Rather, they reflected the everyday fears of ordinary people of death, disease, and mysterious night phenomena that they could not otherwise explain. Now, having studied the ancient and Slavic beliefs, we will move further into Eastern Europe, to the lands of Transylvania and Romania, where the mythology of vampirism acquired special and unique characteristics. Romania is a country at the crossroads of roads, cultures, and religions, where instability and wars reigned for a long time, leading to poverty and frequent epidemics. People lived in constant fear of sudden death, disease, and mysterious phenomena for which they could find no logical explanation. It was in such conditions that the myth of the Strigoi emerged and developed. The nature and powers of the Strigoi. The Strigoi were not just vampires but creatures representing the reanimated dead or cursed souls condemned to return after death to drink blood and terrorize their loved ones. It was often said that Strigoi were those who were evil, cruel, or cursed in life, as well as those whose death was untimely or violent. Romanians were convinced that Strigoi not only drank blood but were also endowed with supernatural powers. They were capable of transforming into animals, controlling the weather, and causing diseases. The power of the Strigoi figure specifically in Romania is explained by the fact that this myth arose in close connection with the everyday life of the villages, where people literally had to confront unpredictable threats every day. Every sudden illness, unexpected death, or poor harvest could be perceived as the result of a Strigoi's curse. The Night of the Strigoi's Return legend. In such conditions, the fear of vampires deeply permeated daily life, which gave rise to many legends and parables that were passed down from generation to generation, strengthening the belief in the existence of the Strigoi and making them an integral part of local folklore. One such traditional story, well known among the inhabitants of Romanian villages, is called the Night of the Strigoi's Return and goes something like this. Once, in a remote Romanian village, an old miller died. In life, he was an unloved, greedy, and evil person. Therefore, people feared that after death, he would not find peace and would return as a Strigoi. When the miller was buried, the villagers waited 3 nights, listening to every rustle and fearing the deceased's appearance. The first 2 nights passed calmly, but on the 3rd night, when the moon was full, a strong wind rose in the village, and the dogs began to bark without reason. People immediately understood that the dead man had returned. The village plunged into panic. Everyone hid in their houses, hanging garlic on doors and windows. Only the blacksmith, the bravest of the villagers, dared to go out to meet him. Armed with an aspen stake and an iron cross, he went to the cemetery. There, by the light of the moon, the blacksmith saw the grave mound stir. The earth slowly parted, and the hand of the deceased appeared. He watched in horror as the dead man rose from the grave. His face was pale, and his eyes burned with a horrifying fire. Overcoming his fear, the blacksmith rushed forward and pierced the Strigoi with the aspen stake straight through the heart. It let out a terrible scream and collapsed back into the ground. In the morning, the peasants found the grave open and the miller's body motionless, with the aspen stake in his chest. Since then, he never returned to disturb the villagers. Such stories and tales were passed down among Romanians for centuries, intensifying the fear of mysterious creatures and emphasizing the need for strict adherence to protective rites. That is why the Strigoi in Romania is not just a myth but a part of the collective memory, traditions, and beliefs that have survived to this day. The historical Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. Having dealt with the Romanian image of the Strigoi and the Slavic Vurdalaks, we will move on to the next part of our lecture, where we will meet the historical figure who became the prototype for the most famous vampire in human history, Vlad the Impaler, known as Dracula. When we speak of the famous Dracula, we most often imagine the vampire as a dark aristocrat, the hero of Bram Stoker's legendary novel. But before the literary character emerged, there was a real man, a prince whose name terrified his contemporaries and became the basis for Europe's most frightening stories. This man was Vlad III, the ruler of the small principality of Wallachia in modern-day Romania. Origins of the name, Dracula and the Dragon. Vlad was born in 1431 in the Transylvanian city of Sighisoara. His father, Prince Vlad II, belonged to the mysterious Order of the Dragon, created to combat the advancing Ottoman Empire from the south. It was through his father's membership in this order that Vlad received his famous nickname Dracula, which literally meant son of the dragon. However, this name soon acquired a completely different meaning, becoming a symbol of terror and cruelty because Vlad later received another nickname, Teeps, or the Impaler. It is this nickname that has been cemented in history as the key characteristic of his personality. A difficult upbringing and the road to cruelty. Vlad's childhood and youth were spent in complex conditions of constant political struggle. When he was a child, he and his brother were sent as hostages to the court of the Ottoman Sultan, where he spent several years. These years were among the hardest of his life. Vlad was constantly under the threat of death, humiliation, and violence. Such a childhood inevitably affected his personality, making him a reserved, harsh, and distrustful person. Returning home, he firmly learned one main lesson: a ruler must be strong, cruel, and ruthless, otherwise, he will fall victim to enemies and betrayal. The political situation around Wallachia at the time also largely explains Vlad's cruelty. The principality was at the intersection of the interests of two powerful states, the Ottoman Empire, which sought to expand its territories northwards, and the Kingdom of Hungary, which tried to strengthen its positions in the south. To maintain power and independence in such conditions, Vlad was forced to resort to cruelty and intimidation as a political tool. And he mastered this tool to perfection. Vlad's reign of terror. Impalement. The most famous and, at the same time, most frightening characteristic of Vlad's rule was execution by impalement. This method of punishment was not an invention of the prince himself, it had been used before him. But Vlad transformed this execution into an instrument of political influence and terror against his opponents. The chronicles describe a famous episode that occurred in 1462 when Sultan Mehmed II sent a huge army to Wallachia with the goal of conquering the principality. To frighten the approaching army, Vlad ordered the execution and impalement of captured Turkish prisoners, displaying their bodies along the roads leading to the capital. This horrifying forest of stakes so shocked the Turkish army that they turned around and retreated, considering Teeps a dangerous madman with whom it was better not to associate. But Vlad's cruelty was evident not only towards external enemies. Harshness and severity became his method of governance within the principality as well. He severely punished all those he considered traitors, thieves, or conspirators. For instance, there are accounts that Vlad once invited boyars, nobles, he suspected of conspiracy to a feast, and immediately after the meal, he had them executed by impalement. This cruelty was a conscious policy of intimidation. Only fear, in Vlad's opinion, could ensure order and unity in his small principality. It is important to note a little-known aspect. Vlad's cruelty wasn't an accident or a sadistic whim, it was part of a meticulously calculated political strategy. In the incredibly complex geopolitical situation of the Balkans in the 15th century, where every small principality had to balance between major empires, fear was Vlad's primary tool of power and guarantee of survival. The sultans, the Hungarian kings, and the local boyars, everyone had to fear the prince so intensely that they wouldn't even consider betrayal or invading his land. Vlad couldn't afford weakness, otherwise, his principality would inevitably fall victim to stronger neighbors. Thus, the real historical Vlad the Impaler was not simply a cruel tyrant, as later chroniclers and pamphleteers depicted him, but a product of a brutal era where only extreme measures could ensure political survival. It was this figure, filled with tragic contradictions and terrifying cruelty, that later became the basis for the creation of the literary Dracula, whose fame overshadowed the reality. The creation of literary Dracula, Bram Stoker's sources. Before we move on to the literary Dracula, let's understand how exactly Bram Stoker transformed this historical figure into the most recognizable and famous vampire image in world culture. the story of Vlad the Impaler might have remained merely a part of medieval chronicles and frightening legends passed down through generations among the inhabitants of Eastern Europe, were it not for the Irish writer Bram Stoker. It was his novel, Dracula, published in 1897, that forever changed the perception of the Wallachian prince, transforming him into one of the most famous literary monsters of all time. The mythological blend. Many assume that Vlad the Impaler was Stoker's sole and direct source of inspiration. However, the truth is much more interesting and complex. In fact, in creating his famous Dracula, Stoker used several lesser-known European myths and legends which he skillfully merged into one figure. Historical and geographical detail. It is known that his personal library contained the book An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, published in 1820 by William Wilkinson. It was here that Stoker first encountered the name Dracula and brief information about Vlad's cruelties. Ancient Irish folklore. Less obvious and more interesting is the fact that Stoker was inspired not only by Romanian legends but also by ancient Irish myths, which were part of his native culture. In Irish folklore, there were blood-sucking creatures similar to vampires, known as the red bloodsucker, likely a reference to the dirge dew. According to legend, this was a beautiful woman, betrayed by her loved ones and lover, who returned after death to take revenge by feeding on the blood of the living. This image of a romantic, yet terrifying, creature bringing death due to tragic love and revenge also significantly influenced the formation of the Dracula character. The Victorian fascination with the exotic. Besides folklore, Stoker actively used information about the mysterious and exotic Eastern Europe, which fascinated the entire Western world in the 19th century. The writer never personally visited Romania, so the descriptions of places and details were products of his imagination, inspired by the exotic stories of travelers of the time. For the inhabitants of Victorian England, Romania was a land of mysticism and dark superstitions, which was perfect for creating a Gothic novel. This perception of an exotic country made the image of Dracula so compelling and convincing for the Western reader. The combination of historical details from the life of the cruel Prince Vlad, ancient legends about blood creatures from Irish tales, and the grim allure of Eastern Europe helped Stoker create the unique and profound literary figure of Dracula. This image, born not from a single source but from a multitude of legends, historical details, and the author's personal fantasies, proved so vivid that it became one of the most recognizable and influential figures in modern culture. The 18th century became the peak of what historians would later call the vampire hysteria. During this time, belief in vampires reached its zenith, transforming from a localized fear in individual villages into a genuine pan-European phenomenon that swept across entire regions of Eastern Europe and the Balkan Peninsula. People, in a panic, massively exhumed graves, burned bodies, and pierced the deceased with aspen stakes, trying to stop the mysterious vampirism epidemic. This strange and frightening phenomenon seemed to be out of control, prompting not only locals but also European scientists, doctors, and priests of the time to ponder the true nature of these events. The role of disease and social anxiety. Today, it may seem strange that the image of the vampire was taken so seriously by Europe during the Age of Enlightenment. However, it is important to understand that the 18th century was a time of profound change and anxiety. Epidemics of plague and tuberculosis were raging across Europe. Mysterious illnesses and sudden deaths were everyday realities. People, lacking scientific knowledge, perceived these phenomena as something supernatural. And vampires were the ideal explanation for mysterious deaths and the spread of diseases. In the Balkans and Eastern European villages, where medicine and science were inaccessible, people sought answers to their fears in the supernatural. This mass panic reached such a wide scale that it even drew the attention of the authorities of major European states. For example, Empress Maria Theresa was personally forced to issue a special decree forbidding the arbitrary exhumation of graves without official authorization. Governments were concerned that the hysteria surrounding vampires was not only spreading superstition but also causing public disorder and panic. Dom Augustine Calmet and the philosophical debate. One of the most interesting and significant events demonstrating the seriousness of the attitude toward vampires in the 18th century was the appearance of the unique work of the French monk and scholar Dom Augustine Calmet, Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and Vampires. Dom Augustine Calmet was not a superstitious person. He was an educated Benedictine monk and scholar who decided to seriously investigate the numerous rumors about the appearance of vampires in Europe. Calmet gathered many eyewitness testimonies, studied official reports, examined the circumstances of strange deaths, and even attended some exhumations. Although his goal was an attempt to rationally explain the phenomenon of vampirism, his work had the opposite effect. Instead of calming people, the treatise, published in 1746, only increased interest and panic among Europeans. Calmet's book became a bestseller of its time, reprinted and translated into various languages. People were impressed that a serious church figure did not deny the possibility of the existence of vampires but only cautiously raised the question of the need for a deep study of the phenomenon. He did not assert that vampires certainly existed, but he did not completely deny it either, offering various rational and medical explanations for the strange cases of the dead returning. Real causes: disease and premature burial. Today, historians believe that most of the so-called cases of vampirism were related to little understood diseases and conditions. Tuberculosis. Victims of tuberculosis looked extremely pale, rapidly lost strength, and wasted away before the eyes of their loved ones, which was perceived as the result of a vampire's night visits. Catalepsy. This pathological state, which externally resembles death, was also a reason why people might come back to life in their graves, creating legends of the deceased returning. Speaking of catalepsy, a condition in which a person appears completely dead externally despite being in a deep stupor, it is worth recalling some real examples that gave rise to numerous superstitions. In the 18th and 19th centuries, cases were repeatedly recorded where people, buried alive due to a mistaken declaration of death, regained consciousness in their coffins. Such events intensified the mass fear of the dead returning and seemed to confirm the reality of vampirism. The most famous story was that of Angelo Hayes from France in the late 19th century, who, suffering from catalepsy, was prematurely declared dead and buried. A few days later, relatives, gripped by doubt, decided to check the grave. The coffin was opened, and the deceased was found alive and gradually regaining consciousness. This case made such a strong impression that special safety coffins began to be used in Europe. Bells were installed over the graves, connected by a rope to the hand of the deceased. A person mistakenly pronounced dead and waking up underground could ring the bell and thus attract the attention of the cemetery caretaker. This is how the famous custom of using cemetery bells spread across Europe and America as a measure of protection against premature burial and the subsequent fear of the dead returning. Thus, the vampire hysteria of the 18th century was not just a surge of superstition. It was a deep socio-cultural phenomenon reflecting the fears of its time, the fear of disease, death, and incomprehensible phenomena that people tried to explain in ways available to them. And Dom Augustine Calmet's book became a striking example of how even a rationally thinking scholar could unwittingly intensify the panic by giving a nearly scientific basis to public fear. Vampire hunters and modern urban legends. Now, having examined the hysteria of the 18th century and its social prerequisites, we will turn to the practical aspects of this phenomenon, the real vampire hunt, the treatises and hunter kits, and the cases where even authorities and police were forced to investigate reports of vampire attacks. The history of vampires and the belief in their existence did not cease with the end of the mass panics of the 18th century. On the contrary, the subject remained popular in later times, taking on new and unexpected forms. Montague Summers, the pious vampire authority. One of the most striking and unusual figures who had a noticeable influence on the perception of vampirism in the early 20th century was the English priest and writer Montague Summers, 1880 to 1948. A mysterious, colorful, and highly contradictory man, Summers was such an unusual figure that his life and works are still surrounded by a mystical atmosphere and many rumors. A priest by education and conviction, Summers nonetheless did not consider the belief in vampires to be merely naive superstition. On the contrary, he was deeply convinced that vampires were real and posed a serious danger to people. This conviction transformed his research into something more than mere academic curiosity. It made his books a living guide to identifying and fighting vampires. Montague Summers authored a number of works, the most famous of which is the book Vampire, His Kith and Kin, published in 1928. In it, Summers provided numerous historical examples, folklore legends, and real cases, described the signs of a true vampire, and carefully analyzed eyewitness testimony. Summers assured the reader that vampires were quite real and posed a threat that must be fought by all available means. It is particularly interesting that, thanks in large part to Summers' books, genuine vampire hunter kits began to appear and spread in Europe and America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These unusual and expensive items were sold to wealthy individuals concerned about the reality of the supernatural threat. Such kits were crafted in the form of beautiful leather or velvet-lined cases and contained carefully selected items for fighting the undead. Inside, one could find an aspen stake with a wooden mallet, a flask of holy water, a crucifix made of silver or iron, as well as prayer books and special texts for exorcising vampires. Pistols with silver bullets were often included in the kits, items more familiar to us from feature films, but which actually existed at the time and were actively sold to people gripped by the fear of the supernatural. Today, these preserved kits sell at auctions for very high prices, as they have become true artifacts of the era, a vivid reflection of the fears that gripped people even in relatively modern and enlightened society. The Highgate Vampire, a 20th century case. Despite the fact that the belief in vampires seems to most of us today to be merely a relic of the past, official authorities had to deal with reports of vampires even in the 20th century. One of the most striking examples, which caused a wide public resonance, was the case in London in the 1970s, known as the Highgate Vampire. This episode not only became part of urban folklore but also drew the attention of the police and the press, becoming one of the strangest and most mysterious events of post-war Britain. In the early 1970s, residents of the Highgate district in London began to complain en masse about inexplicable and frightening phenomena in the old Highgate Cemetery, one of the capital's most famous necropolises. People told the police they saw strange figures wandering among the ancient graves and crypts at night. Some witnesses claimed it was a tall, gloomy man in a long dark cloak, whose face was pale, like a corpse, and whose eyes glowed with a strange, sinister light. Others said they saw a figure levitating above the ground or disappearing without a trace into the shadows. Panic quickly spread throughout the Highgate area, and the fear of the residents reached such a scale that the police were forced to launch an official investigation into these strange occurrences. The police conducted night patrols of the cemetery, interviewed eyewitnesses, and tried to rationally explain what was happening. One of the police's working theories was that the vampire might actually be a person who either consciously decided to frighten local residents or was performing some kind of ritual. However, despite all efforts, the police were never able to find a rational explanation or apprehend the alleged vampire. The investigation was soon closed due to lack of evidence, but the urban legend of the Highgate vampire continued to live on, attracting lovers of the mystical and hunters of the supernatural from all over England to the cemetery. No less surprising events occurred on another continent, in America, though much earlier, in the mid-19th century. One of the most widely reported and documented episodes of vampire panic in America was the case of the Brown family from Rhode Island. We will examine this later, but for now, I will tell you about a lesser-known but equally telling episode that occurred in 1854 in the state of Connecticut, in the village of Jewett City. At that time, a strange and frightening epidemic began in the village. Local residents started dying en masse from a mysterious illness accompanied by severe emaciation and weakness, literally fading away before the eyes of their loved ones. Frightened residents quickly linked this epidemic to the activities of deceased villagers who were suspected of vampirism. The panic reached such proportions that village authorities and local priests sanctioned the official exhumation of several graves to check if the deceased were indeed turning into vampires and sucking the blood of their living relatives. Upon opening several burials, bodies were found that had not undergone complete decomposition. This served as convincing evidence for the villagers, who were certain that the deceased had become vampires. Local authorities, unable to stop the mass hysteria and panic, were forced to agree to carry out special rituals to prevent further vampire contagion of the village. The bodies were subjected to a special procedure. They were removed from their graves, burned, and then their remains were reburied, which, according to local beliefs, should have relieved the inhabitants of the vampire threat. Interestingly, these actions were recorded by the local press and state archives and became one of the last recorded official exhumations in American history specifically related to vampirism. Both of these cases vividly demonstrate that the belief in vampires was not limited only to the distant Middle Ages. Even in relatively enlightened times in the most developed countries in the world, people were ready to seriously believe in the return of the dead and resort to the strangest, sometimes even official, measures to protect themselves from their supposed threat. Rational explanations, the science behind the myths. The belief in vampires has been explained for many centuries by various mysterious phenomena that people encountered in their daily lives. While such events were once perceived exclusively as mystical and supernatural, with the development of science, the real reasons for the emergence of bloodsucker legends have become clear. Modern researchers have been able to identify several specific diseases and conditions that were easily mistaken for signs of vampirism in the past. Porphyria, the real-life vampire disease. One of the most famous diseases associated with vampire myths is porphyria. This is a rare, hereditary metabolic disorder in which the human body cannot properly produce hemoglobin. The disease manifests as an increased sensitivity to sunlight. Even brief exposure to the sun leads to severe burns and ulcers on the skin. The face and limbs of a person with porphyria are covered with scars and blisters, and the skin itself acquires an unusual pale shade, causing suspicion and fear in others. In this disease, the gums often become deformed. The teeth become more noticeable and elongated, resembling fangs. People suffering from porphyria avoid daylight and lead a predominantly nocturnal lifestyle, which naturally gave rise to many frightening rumors. In the Middle Ages and even later, such people often fell victim to superstitions, as those around them perceived their condition as clear proof that they were a genuine vampire. Equally strong influences on the origin of vampire legends were diseases such as tuberculosis, consumption, and rabies. Tuberculosis, consumption known in the past as chikaka, wasting sickness. It caused patients to lose weight sharply, have extremely pale skin, general weakness, and a bloody cough. The disease was contagious and could wipe out entire families in just a few months, creating the impression that one of the deceased was returning to claim their loved ones. This is why in villages gripped by the epidemic, people began to exhume graves in search of the culprit of the terrible disease. They often found the bodies of the deceased that, for one reason or another, had not yet completely decomposed, which only reinforced the local residents' conviction in the reality of vampires. Rabies, hydrophobia. Rabies was considered an especially mysterious and frightening disease because of its rapid development and symptoms that easily fit into the mythology of vampirism. A person bitten by a rabid animal could become aggressive, experience a painful reaction to bright light, exhibit nocturnal activity, and even fall into bouts of fury accompanied by severe cramps and convulsions. Victims of rabies often bit those around them, spreading the disease, and thus the infection seemed like a mystical curse. This, too, was often perceived as the result of an attack by a supernatural creature and caused real panic among the population. The case of Mercy Brown, the last American vampire. One of the most striking and documented stories is the case of Mercy Brown in Rhode Island in 1892. This is a story where the fear of vampires directly intersected with medical ignorance. In the small town of Exeter, the Brown family faced tragedy when first the mother and then her eldest daughter died. Soon, the younger son, Edwin, became seriously ill, gradually wasting away, suffering from a cough and weakness. Town residents could not explain the epidemic other than that one of the deceased family members was returning from the grave and sucking the life out of the living relatives. Suspicion fell upon 19-year-old Mercy, who had died shortly before from the same mysterious illness. Despite the objections of doctors, residents insisted on exhuming her body, confident that they would find signs of vampirism. When the grave was opened, they were astonished. The girl's body, buried in winter and kept in a cold crypt, had barely decomposed, and allegedly fresh blood was found inside her heart. For the local residents, this was unambiguous confirmation that Mercy had returned from the dead and was a vampire. In an attempt to stop the disease, the girl's heart was removed and burned right in the cemetery. The ashes from the heart were dissolved in water and given to the sick Edwin to drink, in the hope that the curse would thus be lifted and the young man would recover. However, he soon died, as the cause of all these deaths was common tuberculosis, against which such methods were completely powerless. This story was widely covered by the American press, becoming one of the last official cases of vampire superstition in America and showing how deeply medical ignorance could influence people's consciousness. Mercy Brown went down in history as the last American vampire, reminding us of how the fear of disease and incomprehensible phenomena could give rise to the most amazing and tragic stories. Modern vampirism, subculture and psychology. Many believe that the belief in vampires and the stories associated with them are forever confined to the distant past, to the Middle Ages or at least the century before last. However, reality proves to be much more complex and interesting. The image of the vampire has not disappeared, on the contrary, it has acquired completely new and unexpected forms in our day. The modern vampire subculture. In recent decades, a phenomenon called modern vampirism has emerged. This is a subculture that unites people who sincerely consider themselves to be genuine vampires in need of human blood or a special life energy. This subculture has its own communities and even organizations, particularly popular in major cities in the United States, the UK, and some European countries. Modern vampires do not hide in dark alleys. Instead, they openly gather in clubs and cafes, organize meetings, conferences, and even balls, for example, the famous annual Vampire Ball in New Orleans. They communicate, discuss their feelings, and find support and understanding from each other. Many of them claim to have a physical need to regularly consume a small amount of human blood. This is not associated with cruelty or violence. Donors voluntarily agree to this procedure, undergo thorough medical checks, and the process itself follows strict rules and adherence to rigorous safety measures. Members of the community believe that blood gives them a special energy and vitality that they cannot obtain otherwise. Renfield syndrome and energy vampirism. Modern science considers such sensations to be part of a complex psychological phenomenon known as Renfield syndrome, named after the character in Bram Stoker's novel obsessed with the compulsive idea of consuming blood. People with Renfield syndrome experience an impulsive craving for blood, believing that its consumption brings them special strength, youth, or immortality. This phenomenon belongs to the field of psychiatric disorders and is studied by modern psychiatry. Psychologists are confident that deep internal problems, past traumas, and a person's need for special forms of emotional interaction with the surrounding world are behind this. But not everyone who calls themselves a vampire today consumes blood. Another type of vampirism, which has been called energy vampirism, is widely spread in our time. This refers to people who feel a psychological need to feed on the emotions and attention of others. Typically, such individuals find a way to elicit strong emotions in those around them, such as pity, fear, irritation, or anger, and thereby obtain the energy they lack for a normal life. Many psychologists believe that energy vampirism is a very real phenomenon related to the disturbance of emotional and social relationships, and it occurs in everyday life much more often than is commonly thought. Interestingly, today's communities of modern vampires actively advocate for tolerance and strive to explain to others that their lifestyle is not associated with violence or crime. On the contrary, they emphasize the importance of donor consent, strict medical control, and absolute safety during their unusual rituals. For many members of such communities, modern vampirism has become a way of self-identification, a search for meaning in life, and even a form of therapy. Today, we have taken a fascinating journey through centuries, myths, and real history, trying to understand how one of the most mysterious and attractive figures in humanity was born and changed, from ancient demons and gods to medieval fears, from Vlad the Impaler to modern communities of people who consider themselves vampires. We have seen how deep and diverse the roots of this phenomenon are. The history of vampires is a mirror reflecting our deepest fears, hopes, and attempts to explain the unexplainable. Thank you for being with me today.